the Winter Lecture Series by the Center. Our guest, Jeremy Walton. Jeremy was trained as an anthropologist at the University of Chicago, and he leads the Max Planck Research Group called Empires of Memory, the Cultural Politics of Historicity in Former Habsburg and Ottoman Cities. This is at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity in Göttingen. And he has a long and distinguished list of publications. I won't read them all, but I would like to mention his very important book published in 2017, Muslim Civil Society and the Politics of Religious Freedom in Turkey. He also has several edited volumes and a number of fascinating articles on various subjects. We're also happy to congratulate Jeremy, who has won an ERC Consolidator Grant, which will begin very soon, just now in April, at the University of Rijeka. It is titled Revivals of the Empire, Nostalgia, Amnesia, and Tribulation. And tonight, we are in for a treat, a sampling of Dr. Walton's current research project. We'll have about 45 minutes for the talk, give or take, and then we will have some time for questions and discussion afterward. And also like to mention very briefly that our next talk in the lecture series will also be by a cultural anthropologist. On February 24th, Yaktan Türkilmaz will present a paper titled Reassessing the Route to the Armenian Genocide in Late Ottoman Historiography. Without further ado, I very much welcome Jeremy, all of you here this evening, and enjoy.
Greetings to one and all. Thank you for that very kind introduction, Brett. In the sort of surreal nature of our times, we're actually sitting in the same room together, but interacting by way of two computers simultaneously. I'll begin just by thanking you all for joining us, of course. I hope you can hear and see me and my PowerPoint. My apologies to those friends and colleagues who joined a bit early. I mistakenly gave an earlier time than in fact we were scheduled for. I said 5 o'clock, but in fact we're beginning at 5:30. So I'm really pleased to be here in Vienna. I had hoped to deliver the lecture, of course, to a live audience, which would be such a change from our usual practice these days on Zoom. But alas, Omicron had other ideas. Nonetheless, I still am here in the city and was indeed inspired quite a lot just wandering around today, and perhaps that will make an impact even on some of my remarks. So it is a great pleasure to be here, and thank you again to you, Brett, and to the Center for Eastern Mediterranean Studies for this kind invitation. And I do hope to be able to see as many colleagues as possible who are online in the near future in person as well. So I have two aims. Let me make sure I can indeed. There we go. I'm never quite sure how to switch the slides on PowerPoint. I have really two aims here today in my talk. The first is to give all of you a sort of general sense of the projects that myself and other members of our research group, Empires of Memory, as well as the future members of Revenant that Brett kindly introduced, what our general sort of purview, perspective, and commitments are. And I have to add the caveat that some of this will be repetition for those of you who've kindly joined me in the past. So I beg you not to judge me too harshly for playing the greatest hits, as it were. You know, you can't give a concert without the top 40 songs. And then in the second half, and indeed longer part of the presentation, I do want to make some more specific arguments about the role of post-imperial religion and heritization, the sort of intersection between those two. And I'll do so with regard to 4 or 5 different sites, but I'll save that argument for the moment and begin with the general overall landscape and purview of the projects. So in both Empires of Memory and indeed in Revenant, which is coming up, we've been focused on what you might think of as inter-imperial legacies and post-imperial memories. And so if there's one catchphrase that you take away from some of my comments, it's that. And I like to illustrate what I mean by that by way of a couple of different sort of standard photographs and images and anecdotes that I have now. Some of you may remember my discussion of food. Even today, as I was wandering through the streets of Vienna, I noticed that there's a bagel and coffee shop called 1683 in reference to the Second Siege of Vienna. Really, it should be a croissant shop, since, as many of you know, croissants, of course, are ultimately a commemoration of the crescent moon and a symbol of the Viennese victory over the Ottomans in 1683. Today, I thought I'd give you another image that I'm quite fond of that really encapsulates and renders vivid the interest in the inter-imperial and the post-imperial. Here you have a headdress from 19th century in Bosnia. Again, you can see it was on display at the Ethnographic Museum in Zagreb, my hometown these days, where you have both the Maria Teresa Thalers and Kurush displaying presumably the Torah of the Salt. I can't make it out at all who it would be, but together in the same object of luxury and indeed conspicuous consumption in that bridal moment. So a literal sort of materialization and combination of empires. I should mention, for those of you who don't know, that Empires of Memory has been devoted primarily to, and indeed we'll move on to this in a moment, to Habsburg and Ottoman imperial pasts and their legacies and collective memories in the present, whereas the new project Revenant will also incorporate the Romanov Russian Empire into the constellation. Somehow, whenever I do this, I guess I have to do it with my mouse rather than with the arrows on my screen as I'm used to. So just to give you a somewhat more of the conceptual background and some of the arguments that we're engaging with on the basis of our projects, Laura Doyle, a scholar of comparative literature, has written quite provocatively and inspirationally on the notion of inter-imperial historical conditions. She recently has a book published with Duke, the term inter-imperiality, and indeed that sort of those formations of particularly collective memories that encapsulate both empires, or multiple empires, I should say, both, of course, I'm referring to the Ottoman and the Habsburg, but really even beyond that, multiple empires are what we're looking at. And then Anne-Laura Stoller, the anthropologist who's written quite influentially on the concepts of imperial formations, imperial duress, durabilities, as she sometimes put it. Here, I think what's important is that Stoller in particular emphasizes that it's not merely collective memory that is the afterlife, if you will, of an empire, but also what she calls imperial formations, duress, the sort of legacies that are not always articulatable in the present, but nonetheless exert a certain pressure, the sort of legacies of the relations of power and indeed material disparities of empire that still exist in the present. So for shorthand, I refer to legacies and memories often when I'm speaking. But what I mean by that, just for clarity's sake, are on the one hand, the pressure that the past and the imperial past in this case exerts on the present. That's what I mean when I use the term legacy. On the other hand, memory is in some sense the inverse, the pressure that the present exerts on the past. Now, that's a bit schematic and perhaps dialectical, overly dialectical for some of you, but it's a nice heuristic, I think, for keeping in mind some of the distinctions that we're making. Again, as I said, in the latter half of the presentation, when we move to some specific sites in Trieste, in Budapest, in Banja Luka, we go through Thessaloniki briefly, and then I'm now even forgetting exactly where we're discussing today. But in any event, when we reach those sites, which I'm sure I will remember when we get there, I do want to make a somewhat more specific argument about heritization, religion, and post-imperialism. Now, there's been a lot written, especially in recent years, as the emergence of sort of critical heritage studies by the likes of Laura Jane Smith, certainly Sharon Macdonald, an inspirational thinker, about heritagization and the role of religion in that. I can also refer you to a very recently published collection of really wonderful essays that was edited by Çiçek İlengiz, a member of our Empires of Memory group, on the Allegra Lab anthropology blog called Heritage Out of Control. So there's obviously a lot of debates that I won't be fully engaging here tonight, but I want to make some basic points about how, particularly in post-imperial contexts, you have heightened questions of space and visibility vis-a-vis religion, heightened dilemmas of nationalism and its relationship to majority and minority communities, and ultimately the most important point, this sort of double movement or contrasting dynamic of materialization and ideologization, or particularization and abstraction. And we'll see examples of both of that in the sites that I discuss momentarily. So again, just giving you a sense of the broad geographic historical purview and outlines of the project. This is a map that I have relied on quite a lot. I'll have to get a better map or a larger map to incorporate Revenant, but this is for Empires of Memory, anchored in 6 post-imperial cities: Vienna, which I have the good fortune of speaking to you from, Budapest, Trieste, Zagreb, Belgrade, Sarajevo, Thessaloniki, and Istanbul. The cities are color-coded. I like to remove the borders. Habsburg, Ottoman, and then the 3, Sarajevo, Belgrade, and Budapest, that have both legacies and also are crucibles for collective memories of both empires in different ways, of course. The smaller cities, I should say, are places that we've conducted some secondary or tertiary research. You see Graz is on there. There's a fantastic military cemetery outside of Graz. I believe it's actually in the town of Leibniz, or it's not even Leibniz, it's one of the smaller towns there in Styria, where you find primarily Bosnian soldiers from World War I who fought for the Habsburgs buried. So that's one site that Annika Kirbis, the doctoral student in our program, has looked at. Others as well I could talk about more, but I'll exhaust myself with too much detail if we don't move on. The point, of course, being that the imperial legacies provide a particular sort of lens on this geography that one isn't available from the perspective of either nationalism or, for that matter, the now somewhat senescent but still forceful geography of the Cold War. So there are a lot of overlapping intersections, as I think I don't need to tell anyone in Vienna, really, throughout Central Europe and Southeast Europe, Anatolia, the Balkans, and beyond, that really we hope to bring to the surface in ways through our research. Now, moving on, and this I think, if I'm not mistaken, is the last slide prior to the more substantive discussion. Actually, no, I'm wrong. I'm going to say a few more things before we get to the sites, and hopefully I won't speak with too great, too lengthily about this. For the new project, Revenant, and you'll forgive me, you have to add the ERC grant numbers and all of these public forums, I'm told, fora. There's a heuristic that I've come up with, really quite commonsensical. It's not, it's not revolutionary in some sense, but the motif of persons, places, and things, those 3 classic categories of nouns that, at least in English language education, one learns, provides a nice framework for thinking about the distinctions and relations among collective memories and legacies. So post-imperial persons, rulers, consorts, and rebels; post-imperial places, centers, ports, and frontiers; post-imperial things, relics, commodities, and memorials. I'm just going to say a few more words about each of these because I think they're quite fascinating, and indeed I probably could go on and I have gone on in the past much longer about these 3 topics. Really, they open to 3 more specific research questions. First, how and why do certain historical personages come to embody collective memories of empires or of empires' demises? Secondly, what processes produce specific places as sites of post-imperial memory, and thirdly, how do bygone empires achieve contemporary embodiment through a variety of objects and material culture. So that's really the sort of general purchase of, well, especially this upcoming project at the University of Rijeka Faculty of Philosophy, I should say Social Sciences and Humanities, as it's called in English. So first, post-imperial persons. Again, I like to think in threes, this sort of tripartite imperative. We have the rulers, and here I've given you a slide of Peter the Great, but from the Ottomans, I think Suleiman will probably end up being the figure we focus on the most, though again, we don't have to decide this yet. Franz Josef is one of the figures from the Habsburgs, though again, there are of course different ways in which the empire is remembered differently depending on the ruler that's brought to the fore. I like this this monument in St. Petersburg, the Bronze Horseman, which itself is an interesting moment of self-historicization on the part of an empire. It was during the reign of Catherine the Great. Evidently, this piece of granite upon which the Bronze Horseman is galloping is the largest rock ever to be moved by humans. It was 1,500 tons originally, and now is, I think, 1,000 tons. Etienne Maurice Falconet was responsible for that. The consorts. Here, I mean, of course, we do have empresses as well as emperors, and not to mention princes and princesses, but often it is the consorts who embody these sort of more visceral and also somewhat more, I don't want to say problematic, but ambivalent memories of the empire. So here we have Meryem Üzerli, a resident originally of Kassel, just down the road from Göttingen as it happens, but she played Hürrem Sultan in Muhteşem Yüzyıl, which many of you may know. Of course, you can think of Sisi. I was bombarded with Sisi, that is to say Empress Elizabeth, the wife of Franz Josef, throughout my voyage through Vienna today, as one often is. For the Romanovs, I think we'll probably will focus on the granddaughter of Queen Victoria of England, that is to say Alexandra Feodorovna, the partner of Nicholas II, and therefore the last Tsarina, who herself was originally Alex of Hesse, interestingly. Finally, perhaps most interestingly, the rebels. Here you have an image of graffiti. This is actually rather standardized graffiti. I've seen it in several places, but it's Gavrilo Princip, Naše Česiene, Hodati po Beču. Indeed, I'm in Bech today. Lutati po dvoru, Plašiti gospodu. So our shadows will wander through Vienna, go about the castle and frighten the lords, something along those lines. Famous words from Princip when he was imprisoned after the assassination of Franz Ferdinand in 1914. He was imprisoned in Theresienstadt, in fact, interestingly enough. Other rebels might include Ataturk and Lenin, I think, and you know, of course, these are massive historical figures who can't be reduced merely to their relationships to the empires that preceded them, and which they both inherited and transformed and rejected in certain ways. And yet, I think examining figures like this from that post-imperial perspective can be quite productive. Post-imperial places, we're going to look at former centers, former ports, and then former frontiers. Again, I'm going to hurry up a bit so we can get to the more meaty aspects of the talk. But Istanbul, this is one of my favorite magnets as it happens. They call it chaos, we call it home. The former centers are often, of course, defined in interesting relationship to other former centers. So Istanbul in a sort of triangular relationship with the former Ottoman capitals of Bursa and Edirne. St. Petersburg and Moscow obviously have a very interesting constitutive relationship with each other, and Vienna and Budapest might also be thought of in that respect. Speaking of Budapest, we have a postmark here, a stamp from the era of the dual monarchy, which is actually meant to gesture to Rijeka, which will be the home of the project Revenant, which of course was known more commonly at the time as Fiume in Italian, though the the postmark, the stamp actually is clearly the classic unmistakable neo-Gothic parliament on the Danube in Budapest. So Fiume, Rijeka was indeed the port city for the Hungarian half of the dual monarchy, in that way a sort of parallel to and competitor to Trieste, just to the north for the Austrian half. Finally, the frontier lands. So in the context of the Revenant project, I think we'll be looking at the Balkans, of course, as the frontier between the Habsburgs and the Ottomans, as well as to some extent the Russians. The Caucasus, a very fascinating contrast and comparison to the Balkans, and then also Galicia, Bukovina for the Habsburg Russian frontier lands. These shatter zones of empire, as Omer Bartov and Eric Weitz have famously proclaimed them, are also not only shadow zones, but zones of mutual influence and synergies, if that's not too neoliberal a word to use, syntheses and synergies. So finally, post-imperial things, the material culture of former empires. This is perhaps my favorite topic. And I'm still thinking about how to sort of organize all of this, but relics, objects that are taken to have an actual material connection to the empires. One of my favorite relics being Pumerin, an inter-imperial relic. Again, think back to this trope of inter-imperiality, ostensibly cast from the cannonballs that the Ottomans heaved toward Vienna in 1683, though the current Pumerin is a replica, I'm assured. The commodities that are often purchased, often ingested. Food would fit in here nicely, and I often find myself returning to food in drink, though here we have some Ottoman miniatures. You see Hurrem Sultan in the corner there. She is exactly modeled after Meryem Uzerli, so it's no coincidence that the mass mediation of empire also has effects in other domains as to how we actually remember what even the figures might have looked like. Memorials are a sort of, obviously persons, places, and things all intersect with one another in certain ways, and memorials are places where this happens. In particular, I'm thinking of, for instance, of the Heldenberg Memorial outside of Vienna, where you have Radetzky's tomb. Here I have the Cheshme column in Tsarskoye Selo outside of St. Petersburg, which again has this inter-imperial aspect to it. It's commemorating Russian victories over the Ottoman navy outside of Cheshme near Izmir in the 1768 to 1774 Russo-Ottoman War, Russian-Turkish War, which Catherine the Great was quite pleased to have won, excuse me. That's strange Freudian slip. Okay, that's the first half of the lecture, essentially. And now we're going to move on to the more concrete, no pun intended, sites and arguments that I want to make. That's it, the Bulgarian church, the Demir Kilisesi or Sveti Stefan Tsrkva. That was the third or the fourth site that I meant to mention before. So really what I want to examine here are sites that are taken to embody and indeed materialize post-imperial religion and the sort of political logics and effects that those sites have, political and discursive, in the present. And again, my general argument here is that you have this dynamic of both particularization and abstraction, both very much materialization and also ideologization. And you see both of these in the first example that I'm giving you, and I've somewhat provocatively put two sites together that are from different post-imperial contexts: the synagogue of Trieste and Sveti Stefan Tsrkva, or the Iron Church in Istanbul. I'm thinking about, I've actually written now specifically about Sveti Stefan in an article that was just published in the last, it's hot off the proverbial presses, even though the presses are no longer hot since it's all digital, but hot off the presses with the Journal of Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association, a special issue that I edited on, it's called Istanbul Through the Looking Glass, my own contribution being on Sveti Stefan Sırpa. So I refer you to this article in the new issue of JOTSA if you're curious for some more specifics there. And I hope to write about Trieste and about the synagogue specifically. But what we see here with these two sites of post-imperial religion is a very similar dynamic, in fact, whereby because of demographic decline in the post-imperial era on the part of minority communities, on the one hand, Triestino Jews, on the other hand, the Bulgarian Orthodox community of Istanbul, the demographic collapse of the communities essentially yields a dynamic whereby the building becomes religion itself. There's very little, I mean, there are, of course, still active congregations in both cities, but neither of them actually meet in the monumental spaces that were once dedicated to them in the late 19th, early 20th century. It's actually this fin de siècle moment is quite fascinating because you have the emergence of a lot of, it has to do with liberalization of certainly of the Tanzimat and the Ottomans, but in similar ways, in fact, liberalization with regard to religion in Trieste goes back a bit earlier, but you have this sort of consolidation of political economic power really on the part of minority communities yielding these structures. And then in the post-imperial moments, you have communities that collapse for a variety of reasons. Of course, the Holocaust is in question with regard to the Jewish community of Trieste. And then the buildings themselves come to take on this role of the marker of the community because the community itself has deteriorated. In the case of Sveti Stefan in Istanbul, you still have a congregation that meets, in fact, in Osman Bey, I believe it is, in a church, Bulgarian Orthodox, but very rarely in the monumental church on the southern rim there of the Golden Horn in Balat. That now, which was restored, and again, heritage restoration is a key theme here, restored only a few years ago with a very prominent ribbon cutting ceremony on the part of Erdogan, as well as Borisov, his equal in Bulgaria. It's only really used in very sort of major holidays, if even that. It's more of a tourist site. The synagogue is a bit different in that it is still used by the Jewish community, but they don't have enough people to actually fill the space of the monumental interior. And here you can see the interior of both of the sites. So they actually meet in a prayer hall to the side, and it's really a quite deteriorated community. First the Holocaust, but then, as in many places, a large scale emigration to Israel after the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. So this is again an interesting dynamic that one sees, particularly with regard to these former. Minority is, as Talal Asad, the anthropologist, has famously argued, this category that the nation state thinks with and through, but minoritized communities that have these imperial roots and no longer exist demographically in any sort of robust way in the present. Here, just to give you a sense of that, are a couple images from Trieste. You can see very clearly, even without being able to read the text, the timeline illustrating the growth and then precipitous decline of the community, particularly during the Holocaust, of course, of the Jewish population of Trieste. You find throughout Trieste, as you do throughout Central Europe, of course, the Stolpersteinen, or stumbling stones, reminding you of former residents who were killed in the Holocaust. Here you see actually a fairly prominent member of the community, Carlo Morpurgo, who passed away in Auschwitz. So again, the general argument here being that heritagization, for all that it sort of comes to glorify and romanticize these sites of minority post-imperial religion as evidence of some plurality in the past. And that's often, particularly with regard to Sveti Stefan or the Demir Kilisesi, this is very much the rhetoric. And again, I can refer you to my article on that, where I spend a lot more time discussing this. For all that they have this sort of romance of the plurality and the happy heteroglossia, as one of my professors liked to say, of imperial times, they also stand as stark reminders of demographic senescence and decline in the present. And indeed, I should point out too that there is a high degree of ideologization going on, even as there also is particularization, materialization. This building becomes the community. It's also this ideology often of a sort of liberal vision of religious plurality in the past that can speak to the dilemmas of the present. So moving on now. I forgot, I added this in at the last moment. Another site, again from this fin de siècle, late 19th, early 20th century moment that I've written about a bit, that in some ways takes this logic to its very telos, to its very sort of end point, is the Yeni Jami, or New Mosque in Thessaloniki, in Salonika, which was the space of worship for the Denme community there. I refer you to Mark Baer's wonderful work on the Denme generally, and their ambivalent relationship to Turkish nationalism as it came to exist over the course of the 20th century. But the Denme Mosque, which was, I think, 1902 by an Italian architect, in fact, a wonderful sort of an Art Nouveau Rococo structure, Vitaliano Poselli was the name of the architect there, became the Archaeology Museum after all of the Denme, well, probably not all of them, but they were subject to the population exchanges of 1923 and 24, even though, of course, they were a unique syncretic community who ultimately worshipped Sabbatai Sevi as a prophet, but took on Muslim forms of worship and therefore had a mosque, even as they also maintained various aspects of Judaism in their practice. So they were considered Muslims and therefore imminent Turks, and their mosque was abandoned to become the Archaeology Museum. You see the Archaeologikon Museon there on the facade. Nowadays, it's a gallery that's occasionally used by the municipality of Thessaloniki, and often explicitly refers back to the sort of, and this, of course, has to do with the policies of Thessaloniki Mayor Janos Koutaris, who's been very prominent in supporting a sort of neo-Ottoman vision of the city as a site of plurality, religious, ethnic, linguistic, and otherwise. So it often refers back to that now, even as, of course, it stands empty, and indeed there is no Denme community any longer to speak of at all. So now we're going to, that section I generally described as the sort of depoliticization of these minority spaces, though there is a repoliticization there as well in terms of this sort of liberal politics of religious plurality. But now I want to move to two other sites that are more indicative of the kind of post-imperial repoliticizations of religion that are one of the many things we're interested in. I'll take us back now to CEU's other, I don't want to say quite former home in Budapest, and Brett can help me here. I imagine you probably actually know more about Gül Baba's tomb than I do ultimately. But here we have, I want to talk about the turbe, the tomb of Gül Baba, a Janissary and Bektashi dervish who accompanied Suleiman and the Ottoman armies in the siege and conquest of Buda in 1541, and then died shortly thereafter. And it is indeed the most prominent site, I think, still associated with the Ottoman era in Budapest. There are others, of course, the Rulas Baths. I'm probably mispronouncing that. But unsurprisingly, though, this, like the Sveti Stefan, sort of has also undergone very recent renovations. Most recently, I think in 2018, when Viktor Orban and Recep Tayyip Erdogan, again, in this similar way. In fact, you look at the photos, it almost could be the same. You know, you have Borisov and Erdogan in front of Sveti Stefan. You have Erdogan and Orban in front of Gül Baba here, sort of cutting the ribbon and opening anew this imperial site that has found new lease on post-imperial life. I like these two photos just because it gives you a sense of how difficult there's something metaphorical about them, how difficult partially that's my own sort of lack of skill in photography, but there is, if you can look very closely on the right, you can see the dome and even the Ottoman half crescent peeking out there from this midst of probably mid 19th to early 20th century apartment buildings. But from above, which is the angle that's privileged by TİKA, the Turkish cooperation and coordination agency, which is largely responsible for most of these renovations, and indeed a topic that's ripe for further discussion, perhaps in the question and answer. We'll return to TİKA a couple times, even in the slides to come. They prefer the view from above, which of course, from a bird's eye perspective, you get a sense of the sort of more substantive site than you might think if you were just wandering through the streets of Budapest. So Gül Baba again accompanied Süleyman on the siege. There you have the turbe and the statue. Now, the bit that I have written a bit about Gül Baba already, and what I wrote about mostly is something that I'm going to now, again, not for the first time, discuss with you, the guest book there at Gül Baba, where you have fascinating comments. And of course, you know, methodologically, one can make a lot of points about the insufficiency of drawing too many conclusions from the comments in the guest book, and yet they are still on some level points of contact with what you might call generally circulating narratives and discourses of neo-Ottoman collective memory in the present. So here we have a visitor who's written, "Burada yaşadığım hisleri anlatmak gerçekten çok zor, bir yandan ecdadımızın yaptıkları ile gurur duyarken diğer yandan son bir yüzyıl içerisinde yaşananlar insan üzüyor. Büyük Türkiye yolunda önemli adımlar atılıyor. İnşallah bir gün buraya çok daha büyük ve güçlü bir ülkenin vatandaşı olarak geleceğim. Allah bizlere bu dileğin gerçekleşmesinde hadin eylesin. Amin." So I've given you the translation here. It's indeed difficult for me to express the feelings. This is my translation. I should say this is from 2015, so it is a bit out of date now, but at the same time, I think still very much present. Indeed, difficult for me to express the feelings I've felt here. On the one hand, I feel pride for the deeds of our ancestors. On the other, the events of the last 100 years truly cause pain and sorrow. Many important steps have been taken on the road to Great Turkey, Büyük Türkiye. This is, of course, a very ideological phrase that circulates particularly in sort of right-wing neo-Ottoman discourse. God willing, one day I'll return here as the citizen of a greater, stronger country. May God propel me in service and realization of this wish. Now, in the essay I've written, I think, if I can recall correctly, I pause a bit longer over some of the other entries in the guest book as well, to sort of point out that there are multiple perspectives on Gül Baba and his legacy even encompassed there. I don't have time to do it now, but one of the ironies, of course, is that as a Bektashi dervish, there is a relationship between Gül Baba and contemporary Alevism. And so there was one person in the guest book who specifically took issue with some of the other commentators and said, you know, it's really quite disappointing that an Alevi, I mean, to call him Alevi would not be entirely correct, but an Alevi figure is being recruited to this sort of neo-Ottoman right-wing Sunni project of Büyük Türkiye. So again, here you see very clearly, on the one hand, the materialization of post-imperial religion in this particular site, the tomb. On the other hand, the ideologization and abstraction of that religious past to become a marker in this sort of discourse of national, and it is very much, I think, a phenomenon of nationalism, perhaps not only nationalism, but a sort of national laundering of the religious past in imperial times to serve means and ends in the present. So finally, and this is, as I often do, I have taken off far too big of a bite to chew and digest fully in a single lecture, because now I'm moving to yet another provocative and difficult context, and perhaps the most difficult one, namely Banja Luka, the city in the northern part of Bosnia-Herzegovina, which now serves as the administrative center of the self-proclaimed entity, the Serbian entity in the divided Bosnia-Herzegovina. So it's this sort of quasi capital city for Milorad Dodik and the Serbian breakaway. I never quite know how to describe this, because even to sort of get into the language of it becomes very political. But in any event, I want to now take us to Ferhadiye Jamia in the city of Banja Luka, which, like Gülbaba tomb in Budapest, was recently restored. And here you see the very dates that are definitive here: 1579, the initial construction of the mosque, which you see here in its restored form, by a student of Mimar Sinan. That's what the general consensus is. They don't know the name of the architect, in fact. 1993, the destruction of the mosque at the hands of Serbian paramilitary forces in the city during the tragic war of the 1990s in Bosnia-Herzegovina as part of the collapse of socialist Yugoslavia. And then 2016, the restoration of the mosque, primarily funded by TICA, and we'll have a bit more of that in a moment. I see there's something in the chat. It's just something that I'll attend to later. There is something about origins and endings in all of this that's probably worth at least gesturing toward, the way in which dates, like material sites, become so concrete and in some sense fetishized in much of this discourse. Again, I should pause to say as a caveat that I won't be able to get into all of the complex aspects of the historiography of the war in Bosnia. Suffice to say that it was horrible, and in particular in Banja Luka, it was horrible for the Muslims living there. All 16 of the mosques in the city were destroyed. Some of them have been restored, such as Ferhadiye, others have not. I do want to just make a few more points about Ferhadiye, though. There you have an image that gives you a sense of the destruction and devastation that occurred then in 1993. Apparently, a lot of the original stone work was thrown into local lakes and rivers in an attempt to really sort of discard it fully so it could never be found again. Like other restoration projects in Bosnia, though not only Bosnia, there's been there was a great premium on recreating exactly the design of the original. So you can think about something like the Frauenkirche, is that right, in Dresden as a model for this. The bridge in Mostar is, of course, another quite famous version of this in Bosnia. What's, of course, fascinating is this moment of restoration. And of course, this is not by any means the only mosque to be restored in Bosnia or the Balkans by Turkish government initiative in recent years. I actually made a quick list of a few just off the top of my head. You have mosques and tombs. It tends to be these two. Sultan Murad tomb in Kosovo, which a colleague, Behar Sadriu, has written quite nicely about in a volume of, history and anthropology that I edited a few years back. The Sultan Murad Mosque and Alaja Ishak Mosque in Skopje, the Alaja Mosque in Foča, also in the Serbian entity of Bosnia-Herzegovina, the Ishak Čelebi Mosque in Bitola Manastir, again in Macedonia. There's some interesting sort of aspects to a Macedonian mosque reconstruction that I won't go into, though I can briefly mention the controversy over the height of the restored minaret of the mosque in Ohrid, the lovely lakeside resort town in Macedonia. Apparently, they are restoring it to a height of something like 35 meters, whereas it had been only 8 meters. So there's certain debates as to, maybe even Freudian debates as to how big it needs to be a proper minaret. And now, actually, quite recently, they've begun restoration on a mosque in Trebignie, another city, in this case in Herzegovina, but again in the Serbian entity of Bosnia-Herzegovina, which was also, like Banja Luka, a site of a lot of violence and destruction in the 1990s. So Farhadia of all of these, at least in Bosnia, was really the sort of jewel, and in particular because it was in this and is in the Serbian region. There was a lot of conflict over the restoration. In fact, one of the earlier efforts was met in 2001, I believe, with rioting, and several people were injured. But ultimately, Tika was successful, and here you see the reopening in 2016. Attending that reopening were Ahmet Davutoglu, who was, I think, prime minister at the time. Of course, Davutoglu, already famous for his speech in Sarajevo some 8 years before that, sort of, and when he was foreign minister, I suppose, pronouncing the sort of what was the name of the policy? It seems like such a sad joke nowadays, but no problems with neighbors, right? A sort of neo-Ottoman soft power foreign policy that he's known for. Also at this reopening was, I believe it was at that time, the head of the Diyanet, or the Directorate of Religious Affairs in Turkey, was not Ali Ercan at that time, but rather Mehmet Gormez, whom I once interviewed actually in Diyanet in Ankara, but that's a different story. Bakir Izetbegovic, the son of Alia Izetbegovic, the first Bosniak president of the tripartite presidency of Bosnia-Herzegovina. At that time, he was president. So it was, of course, this diplomatic performance and ensemble that had to be viewed. And so here you have something else that I want to sort of touch upon: the divergence, in a way, of heritage and religious life in these places. Now, interestingly, despite the fact that Banja Luka is the most violent context that I'm discussing, it also does have, in some sense, the most vibrant community nowadays. A lot of the Muslim population has returned to Banja Luka, and there is, I've attended Friday prayers there several times, and there's a large group that comes to Juma prayer, and you see there on the left a photo that I snapped in one of the Friday prayers at the Farhadia Mosque. On the other hand, you have this, as you can see on the right, this memorial marker, which is interestingly, and I think it's quite fascinating, in Turkish and in English. And this is pointing out that, as you can see, the Farhadiye Pasha Jami was built in 968 after Hijra, or 1579. It is 1579, right? Not 78. I don't know where I got that from. And restored by Tika in 2014 and 2015. It's not in Bosnian, right? The audience for this particular proclamation of collective neo-Ottoman memory is Turkish speaking or cosmopolitan, but it's not local. And so I think, keeping in mind that when we talk about collective memory, there is always a remembering subject that we're implying, and we need to ask who that subject is something that you see very vividly in Farhadia. I'm coming to the end now. I don't know how long I've spoken, because it's very difficult to keep track of these matters as one rambles on. But I added in, as a sort of last slide, in a way, I have a concluding slide, but I think I can skip over that. I want to end here, I think, with some of the more militant, uncomfortable, and indeed violent ideologizations of post-imperial religion. Now, what's interesting about this, as I've spoken about the Süleyman Shah Turbesi and Süleyman Shah as this figure that in some sense adds a sort of post-imperial legitimacy to certain military endeavors in Idlib province and in northern Syria generally in the context of Turkish incursions in the Syrian civil war. For those who don't know, Süleyman Shah is taken to have been the father of Ertuğrul, the founder of the Osmanlı or Ottoman dynasty, and his tomb, although it's technically Turkish land, is located something like 400 or 500 meters across the border in Syria, near I can't exactly, it's near one of the rivers, but I don't remember exactly where it is at the moment. There you see guards at the Süleyman Shah Türbesi. To the right, you see the sort of stylized iconography and symbol of the Süleyman Shah Union or brigade, as it's sometimes translated, a Turkmen paramilitary group that is allied with Turkish forces in northern Syria and fighting with them. So here you see very clearly the way in which this post-imperial legacy and imperial collective memory is being militarized in the present. Now, initially in this slide, I only had that Neo-Ottoman incident, but then I was thinking to myself, really, I have to do this for the Habsburgs as well. It's a very different politics, and yet in some ways very similar. You may be familiar with the Gates of Vienna. It is an English language blog of right-wing supposed anti-jihadist figures. The most infamous contributor to that blog was Anders Behring Breivik, who was a notorious criminal and terrorist who killed something like 80 people in Oslo and then the island of Utøya in July 2011. He was a regular contributor to the Gates of Vienna. Now, he doesn't, of course, think of himself as a Habsburg, but there is this discourse about Christianity that has a relationship to Vienna as a place that is in some sense a neo-Habsburg ideological cartography. You could also think about here in some ways even more pertinent, and I'm sure many of you know this, Brenton Harrison Tarrant, the attacker of the Al-Noor Mosque in Christchurch in 2019, had a direct connection, had a variety of connections to these right-wing groups, but direct connection to the identitarians, the I'm getting the umlaut A wrong again. The Identitäre Bewegung Österreich. He met with figures from that group here in Vienna, apparently at some point, and had insignia of various right-wing. I think Jan Sobieski figured somehow when he was carrying out this live-streamed attack and murderous terrorist act in Christchurch. So there is this militarization of other post-imperial memories as well. For Russia, we're going to have to wait on that for the next project, but certainly the new cathedral that has been built outside of Moscow, which is a project of the Russian military and explicitly puts Putin into a sort of neo-imperial kind of iconography, literally, where he's equated with Peter the Great and others, suggests that the militarization of post-Romanov memory is also ripe for further exploration. So with that, I'm going to end my remarks, and I really look forward to the discussion and comments. And thank you again, Brett.